From the 23rd Psalm, we know that the Good Shepherd is one who makes his sheep to lie down in green pastures and who spreads a table before them in the presence of enemies. In this session, we will hear of two banquets mentioned in the Gospel of Mark, one of death and the other a banquet of life.
In our reflection on the Good Shepherd, as the Good Shepherd appears in the New Testament, in our last study, we looked with some care at the appearance of the Good Shepherd in the parable of Jesus in the 15th chapter of Luke. There he tells us he is the Good Shepherd, but the great prophets of old, on one of their methodologies for creating and communicating meaning was the dramatic action. It wasn't just what they said, it was what they did. And that's one of the very important reasons why the Gospels are the way they are. They're not just a string of the sayings of Jesus, but they are the sayings of Jesus and the things he did. At the same time, they are not a full-blown biography. If they were, we would be told with some detail what Jesus did from age 12 until age 30. We aren't. John says, we beheld his glory. Fine, they looked for those primary events in his life where the glory of God was showing through with special intensity, and they recorded them. And that's why they recorded them, and that's why they are a selection. So we have looked at Jesus, who explains to us through a parable that he is the Good Shepherd. We want to now look at Mark and see what Mark says about the Good Shepherd, because in Mark, Jesus affirms his being the Good Shepherd by acting like it. He acts out the responsibilities of the Good Shepherd in a very striking and unforgettable way. This occurs in Mark 6, which we can call the Good Shepherd and his banquet of life. And this is set in a series of scenes. And the first scene is Jesus in his hometown, which is chapter 6, verse 1 to 6. And we find there that some people listened to him and some people didn't, and that they don't really believe in him, and they complain about, well, who is this young whippersnapper, and where did he get all of this, and isn't this the carpenter's son, and don't we have his brothers and his sisters here among us? And it says they took offense at him. And after that's over, then Jesus decides that it's time for him, and perhaps because of this rejection in his hometown, he decides that he is going to send out the 12. And so we have an account of his sending out of the 12, and he gives to them 3 principles of mission as he sends them out. And we can pause briefly to notice them. He says, first of all, don't take any bread and no bag and no money, only a staff, that's what you climb with, shoes and 1 tunic. Why? Because he wants them to go in need of the people to whom they go. He doesn't want them to show up and look like a Greek or a Jewish merchant with all kinds of goodies on the back of the donkey. You go needing the people to whom you go, and you have an automatic opportunity to talk to them in a special way. This is Jesus himself in the 4th chapter of John, sitting at the well. He could have gone with the disciples into the city to buy food, and he could have told them, leave the bucket behind. He doesn't want to have any buckets so that whoever shows up, he can say, I'm thirsty, can you give me a drink? He wants to be in need of them. And the story unfolds with this principle of mission enacted in a very powerful way in that story. And the second thing is, he says, don't go from house to house. Middle Eastern hospitality is fantastic. They feed you to the place that you just can't believe it. There's always enough food on the table for an army, and you wonder who's going to eat all of this, and there's the constant eat this for my sake type of thing. So Jesus says, don't set up a can you top this. Everybody's got to compete with their neighbor, and they're offering you more food than they can afford and that you can eat. Find someone who is eager to hear your message and will welcome you and stay in that house so that you don't get into all of the nonsense that comes along with going from house to house. And finally, in those instructions, amazingly, he gives them a game plan for failure. We translate it the dust on the feet. It's actually, in 5 out of the 6 times that we have this language used, it's the dust of the feet. And what you mean by that is that the ancient roads, with the exception of the Roman roads, were not paved, and because it stops raining in February and doesn't rain until the next November, that carts and animals and horses and people, you get a thick layer of dust on the roads, and anybody who walks along that, this dust is going to come up into their clothes. So the first thing you do before you go into your house or somebody else's house is you take off your jacket and you shake off all the dust, and then you put your jacket back on and you go into the house. And this is enacted by Paul once in the 12th chapter of Acts, in which he's thrown out of a town. He takes off his jacket, he shakes off the dust against them, puts the jacket back on, and goes on to the next responsibility with joy. How do you walk away from failure and start the new task with joy? One of the things is the sacrament of failure, which no church has ever picked up because we don't want to talk about failure. But Jesus gave them a methodology to deal with failure in his very first sending out of the 12. So they go out, and then they begin their ministry of teaching and healing. And the next scene shifts to King Herod and to John with King Herod. And John was well enough known that it's obvious that he had access to Herod's palace, because Herod, it says, he liked to hear him, even though he was troubled by what he was saying. Well, Herod didn't show up and stand with the riffraff at the back of the crowds. He obviously invited John into the palace to have his say. And what his say, we're told that Herod respected John, feared him, was perplexed by him, liked to listen to him, but he was very nervous about parts of what he was saying because he was nailing Herod for having married his brother's wife. All right, then there's going to be a party, and the party is a celebration. And we're told that Herod invites the administrative staff and the military and the governors of the towns and villages, of course, whom he had appointed. You've got the White House staff, you've got the top brass at the Pentagon, and you've got the governors of all the states for a party in the White House. This is a pretty important party because you've got the centers of power represented there, even more so in a dictatorship. What happens? They all get drunk. They get a dancing girl. The dancing girl is the stepdaughter of the king, and they like it, and he, half drunk, offers to her anything she wants, and then she goes out and talks to her mother, and her mother says, ask for the head of John the Baptist. In the process, the mother traumatizes her daughter for life. She humiliates her husband in front of the most powerful people in the province. And third, she sees that a totally innocent man is brutally killed for no reason. So we're talking about grim evil on a very profound level. All right, word goes out that this has happened. And what's going to happen now? Well, the mission to the 12 is suddenly over. And it's over because everybody wants to know, what are we going to do next? If John the Baptist can get killed in this kind of an irresponsible way without any reason at all, can anybody else open their mouth? And so they all hustled back to Jesus to say, are we going to go underground? What are we going to do? We're told that the disciples gathered around him and told him all that they had done and said. And he said to them, come away to a desert place all by yourselves and rest a while. We're going to have a little spiritual life retreat as we pray and try and bring our souls back together. Number 2 in our movement is John the Baptist. He's been murdered and we don't know who's going to be next, and we got to think about this. So we're told, for many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. This phrase, many were coming and going, we have only here in the entire New Testament. And what's this bit about coming and going? People from villages all across Galilee are rushing to Jesus to see what he has to say about the murder of his cousin. And they're very eager to find what Jesus has to say. And they're going back to the villages to tell where Jesus is and to give whatever answer Jesus may have given them. So, all right, the spiritual life retreat, and they went away in the boat to a deserted place, and many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. The phrase, the apostles gathered around Jesus, is a special rare Greek word which means gathered together in view of frightening signs. They're demonstrating solidarity to Jesus in the midst of the painful tragedy of a member of his household. The disciples' stance is, what are we going to do now? It's all over. These people play hardball. It's violent and irresponsible. We have no protection under the law. Who's next? Nathanael, when he thundered at David about Bathsheba, David went off and wrote the 51st Psalm. The prophets are supposed to have a certain protection. They alone can yell and shout and scream at the king, but you can't touch them because they're prophets. Well, Jeremiah, yeah, you can arrest him and put him down into a pit, but you can't kill him. So what's the deal? Nathan got away with it when he thundered at David about Bathsheba. How come John the Baptist gets killed? They've got lots of questions. None of us is safe. The cultural pressure on Jesus is, this is your cousin, and you are responsible to join with your family in the act of retaliation. There's a word for it, thar, which we can best translate blood vengeance. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth was the law of Moses, and it was in force. So how are you going to deal with the fact that it's the king that has murdered one of your family, and you are responsible to get the eye for an eye, but it's a little different when it's the king? We've got to talk about this and see what can be done. Can we really proclaim the coming of the kingdom of God when the kingdom of Herod murders us at a drunken banquet to please a dancing girl? What are Jesus' options? He can call for a regime change and agitate for it. He can join the Zealots, a relatively overground movement, and advocate violence. He can join the Sikarim, the assassins, who are an underground movement who killed people like Herod. They can complain to the Roman governor in Damascus that Herod has violated Roman law and get Herod in trouble. Or they can seek an audience with Herod himself. They might or might not succeed. And if they do, give it to him. Risk also being themselves killed. Or they can all go home. What's it going to be, Jesus? What are we going to do? Answer, we're going to take a spiritual life retreat. The crowd shows up, but they are, we're told, from all the villages. They're there with an agenda. They want to know what is Jesus' response to the murder of his cousin. He's the head of the renewal movement, and what does he think about the murder of John? And among the crowd, there are Herod's spies. I lived in a total dictatorship under the late President Nasser in Egypt for 10 years, and I know what it's like living under total dictatorship. Your phone is tapped and your mail is opened, and everything you say has to assume somebody around is one of the informers for the secret services, and what you have to say is going to reach their ears, and it's going to be recorded and put into your file. You have to assume this. Herod is also very interested in what Jesus is going to do. And he is going to tell his security people, follow this guy and find out what he's telling the people. Do we have a mini revolt that is starting to simmer here? Are we going to have to take some kind of action and arrest this guy and cool this whole thing down until the whole thing across the entire district cools down? All of this is being stirred in the air. And so then we get the story as to how Jesus is going to respond. He goes ashore, and it says he saw a great crowd. Whoops. No spiritual life retreat right now. And we're told he had compassion for them. The compassion is not just because they're poor, which they probably were, but they live in a world in which the ruler can do anything he likes and kill anybody he wants to, and they have no protection before the law. And he has compassion for them. And it says in the text, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. Boy, do we wish we had a tape recorder there to record what that half a day of lecturing was really all about. I am very sure he talked about costly demonstrations of unexpected love, and talked about the redemptive nature of suffering, and that he talked about the servant songs of Isaiah. I don't know what else he talked about, but I wish we had more record of what happened. They are mesmerized. He does not call for a march on the king's palace and a great public demonstration against this brutality. He says other things to them. They are so mesmerized they don't know that the sun is going down and they're some distance from home. It grows late, and the disciples notice this, and they come to Jesus and say, look, this is a wilderness. The hour is late. Send these people away, that they can go to the surrounding villages and buy something and get themselves something to eat. They've come from a long ways. They're going to have to spend the night someplace before they can hike across the countryside and get to the villages from which they have come. His answer, you give them something to eat. And they answer, well, come on. We can't possibly do that. 200 denarii, which would be the working wage of a working man for 200 days. A denarius was a day's wages. 200 days' wage, 2/3 of a year's wages for a working man wouldn't be enough to feed these people. And he says to them, all right, how many loaves do you have? They check and they find out we've got 5 loaves and 2 fish. He ordered them to make all the people lie down in green pastures. What's going on here? The Good Shepherd is starting to lead his flock. And the first thing he has to do is to get them to lie down. And he tells them to lie down in the green pastures, and Mark mentions the green pastures because Mark hears the fact that this story is an enactment of the Good Shepherd, who is the person of Jesus. And he tells them to lie down symposia, says the Greek text. This is the only time in the entire New Testament we have this Latin word in its Greek form appearing in the New Testament. Now, what is a Greek symposia? We discover this from Plato's Republic. You get a group of intellectuals together and everybody starts drinking and you start debating philosophy, and pretty soon you start drinking other people under the table and it becomes rather rowdy before you get done. That's a symposia. That's what Herod did. Only Herod's symposia got out of hand. And before the symposia was all over, it was a symposia of death. Someone was killed and his head put on a platter to please a woman. So now, okay, Herod has had his symposia, and now Jesus is going to have his own symposia. Gather together in groups like a symposia, and they reclined in groups of 100 and of 50. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke them. The Psalms talk about Moses when Moses is in the wilderness and they ask, can he provide bread and meat for the people? And the answer is yes. There is the bread in the manna and there is the meat in the quails. So Jesus is not only enacting the Good Shepherd, he is also reenacting the primary miracles of the Exodus. And after this scene is over, they get into the boat and they end up with the still waters. All right, Moses got the bread and the meat by asking God to give it to them. Jesus doesn't ask God to give it to them. He himself provides it. He is the divine presence among the community. We already discovered that from his affirmation of himself being the Good Shepherd. Now we see it enacted as he enacts the second of the great miracles of the Exodus. They gave it to the disciples to set before the people. He divided the 2 fish among them, and all ate and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces of the fish, and those who had eaten the loaves numbered 5,000 men. And immediately he forced his disciples to get into a boat. This is a very strong word. Why? There was rumblings in the crowd. If this man can do this kind of miracle, then he's got miraculous power to do other things. And how about we declare him our king and we start the movement? Jesus calms the whole thing down. First thing he does is he tells the disciples, get into the boat and get out of here, because the disciples are probably thinking along those lines and very happy to join this kind of a development. And then he tells all the people to go home. He doesn't want to start a revolution. He wants to make a statement. And he wants to make a statement to Herod himself personally. You, Herod, have spread before the leadership of the entire province a banquet of death. The people in front of me were the poor who had come from all across the same province. And I have spread for them a banquet of life. And so the leaderships of the village, when they go home after this is all over, they're going to tell the story about the banquet of death. And these poor people who've come from all the villages to hear how I'm going to respond, they're going to tell about the banquet of life. And you, Herod, have got to notice this. That at the same time, in the same place, in the same days, this province was given an example of a banquet of life and a banquet of death. And they will be able to choose, Mr. King, which is the greater of these banquets. This is incredible stuff that we have going on here. And we find, as we try to summarize the comparisons between the Psalm 23, first of all, he sees them as a sheep without a shepherd. Second, he makes them lie down, and they lie down in green pastures. He prepares a meal before them. He prepares a table, if you please. In the presence of their enemies, Herod and his spies are watching, and they eat and are filled, because my cup runneth over. We have an enactment of the 23rd Psalm. We have a replay of the Exodus. We have a banquet of life and a banquet of death. And we have a foreshadowing of the Eucharist. Now let's try and very briefly summarize what we find here in this great story as we try to look and see what occurs in this by way of summary. And we can see the following great themes in the story. The first is, a good shepherd feeds his sheep. Jesus sees the crowds as sheep without a shepherd. He has compassion on them, and in spite of his exhaustion and his pain, he decides to lead them and feed them. Third, the setting of the story is in the open pastures, not in the city, not on the shore, and not in the synagogue. It is, or any other location. This is deliberate. We notice also the green pastures, which we mentioned. And we notice that they are passing through the valley of the shadow of death, because John has just been killed. And we have mentioned the table spread before them in spite of that shadow. And food is left over. The cup is running over. He takes charge of the flock from the beginning through the middle and to the very end, like a good shepherd. And in the next story, he provides for the still waters. Also, we notice the new Moses that cares for the people in the wilderness. Moses provided bread and meat for the people in the wilderness. Jesus does the same thing. Jesus is the new Moses, but there is a difference. Moses was obliged to ask God for the meat and bread. Jesus looks up into heaven, but Jesus is the one who provides the meal. He is the divine presence among the community. God is acting through him. Jesus offers a banquet of life, and the banquet of life in the shadow of the murder of his cousin. And we are called upon to look at this great story, this great enactment of the 23rd Psalm, and see that Jesus not only in parabolic form affirms himself to be the Good Shepherd, we see him in this story acting out significant aspects of that story told by David.